Jessie Yates-Johnson. She's going to be talking about her master's research on the Brazos watersnake. Jessie is a grad student at Stephen F. Austin State University, and she's already defended her thesis, and she told me before the talk that everything went well, and so she's set to graduate next month. Jessie received her BA in biology from Texas Christian University in 2018 and is set to continue research in the ecology of reptiles in wetland habitats as she works on her PhD in integrative and conservation biology at the University of Central Florida, which I assume starts in the fall, Jessie. You're just getting straight on with it. And one final note, and that is that Jessie's work that she'll be presenting on today was supported in part by a conservation license plate grant license plate funded grant to her advisor, Steve Mullen, who I believe is in attendance today. So with that said, Jessie, I'll turn it over to you and take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thesis research today, and thanks to everyone attending. My thesis research primarily concerned the occupancy modeling of Brazos River watersnakes. But before I jump into detection probabilities, I want to give you guys some background information, hopefully to place this all into context and give you some information about why we should even care about detection probabilities of this beautiful snake here. So for quite a while, but particularly over the past 50 years, we've really seen declines in biological diversity or biodiversity. There are many different reasons why we're seeing these declines, but we do know that the single largest threat to biodiversity is habitat alteration, which can lead to a couple different outcomes. The first of those being the fragmentation of habitat, where you have a single larger piece of habitat that is broken down into different pieces or patches. Those patches may or may not be connected to one another, and they may or may not be suitable for the species that were present in that larger area. The second outcome, and the worst between these two, is the complete loss of habitat. And so through both of these processes, you oftentimes find the local extinction or the extirpation of species from that larger area. There are two groups of species that we consider to be more vulnerable to extirpation than others. The first of those being large-bodied animals with sporadic distributions, and the second of those, and the worst between these two groups, are species with a restricted range. The ultimate example of a species with a restricted range is an endemic species, or one that is unique to an area or a range and found nowhere else in the world. And so in this image on the bottom right, you see a map of the United States with our endemic reptile species. And you can see that oftentimes with endemics, you'll get these areas or these hot spots where you have quite a few different endemics in an area. Not all taxa experience declines and threats of extirpation equally. For example, within Herpetofauna over the past 30 years, we've really documented pretty steep declines in amphibian species. However, recent data is suggesting that reptiles might actually be declining in a manner similar to that of amphibians. We know right now that 1/4 of all reptiles are listed as threatened, although that number is likely underestimated, and we have a very poor understanding of why reptiles continue to decline. We know that patterns of reptile biodiversity typically correlate with variables such as water and temperature, and that makes sense when you're thinking about these ectothermic organisms. And so those associations with variables like water and temperature could place these organisms to be in a position where they are more vulnerable to increasingly severe stochastic weather events associated with climate change. For example, if you are a reptile, particularly a semi-aquatic reptile in the Brazos River watershed, over the past few decades, you've experienced some pretty severe stochastic weather events, including the D4 exceptional drought of the early 2010s when entire portions of the river dried up, and just recently, the 2021 record-breaking winter storm when entire portions of the river froze over. These semi-aquatic reptiles themselves are more vulnerable to habitat alteration because they rely on both terrestrial and aquatic habitats. For example, water snakes, such as this one seen here, rely on aquatic habitats for activities such as foraging, but they also rely on terrestrial habitat for activities such as overwintering, as depicted here. Water snakes are snakes within the genus Nerodia, and they range across much of North America. They're often found in these communities where they are not only coexisting with other Nerodia species, but also other natricine snakes as well, such as Thamnophis species, which are the garter and the ribbon snakes, as seen here with the Nerodia. These snakes are able to coexist with one another because oftentimes they will partition or specialize on specific resources within that environment. And they also tend to exhibit ontogenetic shifts in resource use, which means that they just change their use of resources across their life history. In the upper middle reaches of the Brazos River, as seen here, we have 3 different Nerodia species. And so I want to give you guys a brief overview of each one before I jump into some of the analyses that I did. So first, we have Nerodia erythragaster, the plain-bellied water snakes. These guys range across much of the southeastern United States and are fairly common throughout their range. Erythragaster is piscivorous as a juvenile, so it will eat fish. But they're really known as an adult to shift to a diet primarily composed of amphibians, particularly frogs. Erythragaster is a pretty typically sized water snake, certainly similar to many other species of Nerodia that you would find in the States. Second, we have Nerodia rhombifer, or the diamondback water snakes. These guys do not range quite as far east as Erythragaster, but they do range down into Mexico and are also very common throughout their range. Rhombifer is piscivorous across all life history stages, so they're really known to eat fish throughout their life. And they're also very similar in terms of size to Erythragaster. Finally, we have Nerodia harderi, the Brazos River water snake. This is the water snake endemic to the Brazos watershed. However, you can see in this map that even within the Brazos watershed, as seen here in purple, they really only occupy a very small portion of the river, only about 300 river kilometers, which is one of the smallest geographic ranges of any North American snake. Harderi is also piscivorous, and it's important to note that between these 3 Nerodia species, Harderi is generally the smallest water snake that we have in this portion of the river. Really only those individuals of Harderi that are sort of pushing the upper reaches of that size range do they begin to resemble Erythragaster or rhombifer. Harderi was first collected in 1938 by Mr. Philip Harder, from whom the species is named, in a portion of the Brazos River in Palo Pinto County, Texas, seen here. Harderi is one of 2 endemic snake species within the state of Texas, along with the Concho River water snake, Nerodia possemaculata, whose range is seen here. And because of that really small geographic range that I mentioned, Harderi is listed as near threatened by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and threatened by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Harderi is known to be a microhabitat specialist, really focusing on 2 key features within their environments. The first of those being in-stream riffle habitats. And so you can see in this video up here on the upper right, we have a juvenile Harderi that has taken the latter portion of its tail, wrapped it around a rock to anchor itself so that the rest of that body is free to strike at minnows swimming through that riffle. And so in-stream riffle habitat is particularly important in the juvenile life history stage for foraging activities. Harderi is also known to associate with rocky shorelines, particularly those rocky shorelines such as this, that have very large flat stones that really promote effective thermoregulation of those snakes. Scott et al. Provided the most comprehensive study of the species, conducting surveys between 1979 and 1987, and they determined that the species was relatively secure so long as appropriate microhabitat was present within that river. So the in-stream riffle and rocky shoreline habitat that I just mentioned. In fact, they determined that Harderi's reliance on those microhabitat features was the single variable really restricting the overall range of that snake. However, beginning in the late 1990s and continuing into the early 2000s, surveyors began to notice some local declines in Harderi. And so in 2009, Dustin McBride came along and did a range-wide study of Harderi. And he found that while the general range of Harderi remained intact, they had indeed experienced population declines and or extirpations, thereby making them a rare snake within their range. Since this second comprehensive study of Harderi, further population declines and or extirpations have been suggested. Different authors have suggested threats to Harderi, among them being the alteration of river habitat invasive salt cedar, and disease. And so today I'm going to focus on the first two threats listed here. If you're interested in learning more about disease and what disease could affect hardeye and other water snakes, I encourage you to look back through the YouTube series of the wildlife diversity webinars and find the snake fungal disease webinar given by Dr. David Rodriguez. So much like many other semi-aquatic snakes with very specific microhabitat requirements, it is thought that the alteration of river habitat is the single largest threat to hardeye. And the Brazos River has experienced extensive habitat alteration over the past 100 years, primarily in the form of damming. And so in these two images, you see the type locality of hardeye located in Palo Pinto County, as I mentioned. In the image on the left, you see that type locale as it appeared during the Scott et al. Surveys of the 1980s. And so you can see we have quite a bit of in-stream riffle habitat as well as extensive rocky shoreline for those snakes to use. And so this really represents optimal hardeye habitat. Compare that to the image that you see over here on the right, which is one that I took just last year at the same location. And it seems as if we have lost that in-stream riffle habitat. Instead of extensive rocky shoreline, we just have these rocks sort of scattered throughout the channel. And by virtue of this location being not too far downstream from Possum Kingdom Reservoir, one can make the argument that this is simply associated with fluctuating water levels as a result of water releases from Possum Kingdom. However, after surveying this location at several different points throughout the year, I can attest that this location appears this way for much of the year. I also want to direct your attention to the image on the left where we have this rock in the distance. And you can see sort of a dark band there as well as these two rocks at an angle and this smaller rock. And so we have those same features here. This band is still visible here as well as the rocks at an angle. And so you can see that the water level actually really hasn't changed that much in 30 or so years, supporting the fact that we probably have lost that crucial microhabitat for hardeye. In these two images, you can see different portions of the watershed. So on the left, we have the Clear Fork of the Brazos River located in Shackelford County. And you can see that in this very short stretch of river, we have quite a few different microhabitats available for organisms. So up here at the top, we have the bottom portion of a run, as well as this pool microhabitat. And then we have this whole section of really great in-stream riffle habitat. You can see the rocky shoreline, once again, representing optimal hardeye habitat. Compare that to what you see on the right, which is just downstream from Possum Kingdom Reservoir. You can see how channelized that river has become. There is no in-stream riffle habitat. We do not have extensive rocky shoreline. The shoreline that is there is really homogeneous in terms of vegetation and microhabitat, really representing suboptimal habitat for hardeye. However, populations of hardeye are known to occur within Possum Kingdom Reservoir and Lake Granbury in Hood County. Where these snakes are found, they're often associated with riprap along the edges of these reservoirs that can act as riffle-like habitats. However, it's thought that hardeye is potentially intolerant to desiccation. They're rarely found more than 3 meters from the water's edge. And so these snakes are less likely to travel from one suitable habitat patch to the next. And so these reservoirs, and particularly these dams, could really act as barriers to dispersal, and these snakes could have reduced fitness as a result of that. Salt cedar is an invasive plant in the United States. It was first used as an ornamental plant and then as a bank stabilizer in the 1800s. Salt cedar easily establishes itself within riparian habitat, and then once established is a dominant competitor over native riparian vegetation. Salt cedar is not only disturbance tolerant, but it often thrives in disturbance events such as droughts and flooding. And salt cedar is really associated with reductions in river quality for a few different reasons. Salt cedar first has a very deep taproot that can access water deep underground during severe drought events, but it also has a very profuse fine lateral root system that can really exploit the entire soil profile for water. That fine lateral root system is also associated with increased sedimentation of river channels, particularly post-damming, and this can lead to the overall narrowing of a river channel over time. In certain portions of the Brazos River, such as this scene here, where we have really extensive stands of salt cedar along the bank, these portions of the river have seen as much as 70% channel narrowing after salt cedar is established. Finally, salt cedar can not only tolerate increased salt levels of the soil, but the plant itself can also deposit salt through glands in its leaves. And so this overall association with reductions in river quality has led to several authors suggesting that salt cedar could be involved in declines of harder, particularly if those reductions in river quality lead to the loss of riffle habitat, which we already mentioned is so crucial for juvenile foraging. So Texas Parks and Wildlife was really interested in an updated survey of harder focusing on several different aspects of its biology. First, they were interested in an estimate of survivorship from one year to the next, as well as probabilities of species detection and site occupancy within intact riverine habitat, so to the exclusion of reservoir populations. And finally, just an overall update on the population status of the snake where it was historically known to occur, and more information about certain life history traits, because we really don't know too much about this snake when compared to other snakes within the watershed. And so in order to accomplish these objectives, I established 15 survey sites along the historic range of Harderai, and every survey site had appropriate microhabitat for Harderai, so in-stream riffle habitat and rocky shoreline. And so on the ground, this habitat appears much like this. You can see that in-stream riffle habitat, pretty extensive rocky shoreline. And so within every survey site, I established a 250-meter transect that followed the course of that river. And we had two general groups of transects. We had those transects above Possum Kingdom Reservoir. So you're seeing a zoomed in map, zoomed in from the previous map. And you can see that we have a transect here on Deadman Creek, and then we had 9 transects along the Clear Fork of the Brazos River. Our second group of transects were those below Possum Kingdom Reservoir. And you can see we have one located at the type locality of Harderai as well. And so a typical survey consisted of searching for snakes along that transect. And that was accomplished either by wading in shallower portions of the river or canoeing in deeper portions of the river. I recorded all snakes that I observed and encountered, and I processed all captured snakes. In order to estimate survivorship of Harderai, I used the marked package in our statistical software, which uses capture, mark, recapture data. And so that just means that I would capture a individual Harderai. I would give it a unique identification number so that when I release that snake and hopefully capture it again, not only do I realize what snake that is, but I know that it survived from time A to time B. And I also have really great information about how that snake has grown in that time. In order to estimate species detection and site occupancy probabilities, I used the unmarked package in R, which operates on the idea of imperfect detection. And that just means that observation or detection of a species is indicative of species presence. However, non-detection is not necessarily indicative of species absence. This gets at the idea of these snakes being sneaky. So these snakes may be in that environment, but we're just not observing them for whatever reason. Occupancy and detection within unmarked can be estimated naively, meaning that they do not have the influence of covariates, but you can also estimate both parameters as a function of covariates that you choose. We have site-level covariates that predict site occupancy probabilities, and we have observation-level covariates which predict species detection. In order to compare all 3 of these Nerodia species, I obtained naive estimates of site occupancy species detection. And then in order to inform future survey efforts of Harderai, I obtained naive estimates of both parameters as a function of individual transect and sampling season. And so over the course of 2 years and 8 surveys, I observed 188 different snakes that were identified to 10 different species. So the most frequently encountered snake was the diamondback water snake, Nerodia rhombifer. The second most frequently encountered species was the was the western ribbon snake, Thamnophis proximus, which you can see here. And then the third most frequently observed snake was the target species, Nerodia harderai. 42 different harderai were observed. 36 of those were within survey transects. The most frequently encountered life history stage was neonates, followed by juveniles, and finally adults. All harderai were found in a variety of microhabitats, although most of those were associated with rock and riffle microhabitat, which is consistent with what we know to be true about the species. Finally, survivorship of harderai was estimated to be 9.2%, although this is likely underestimated and is likely a poor estimate given the low rate of recaptures. Estimates of site occupancy and detection varied as a function of species. So the highest probability of a site being occupied was for Nerodia rhombifer, but the highest probability of detecting any Nerodia species was actually for Harderi. Occupancy and detection also varied within Harderi as a function of sampling season. So the highest probability of a site being occupied by Harderi was during spring, but the highest probability of detecting Harderi was during autumn. In this table, you see the competitive models for occupancy and detection by species. And so I'm going to focus on each species individually. So for Harderi, the probability of finding that snake within a transect was actually fixed for all top models. So no site level covariates predicted the probability of Harderi occupying that site. However, species detection varied as a function of search effort and wind velocity. For Erythrogaster, the probability of a site being occupied by that species varied as a function of the number of riffles present within a transect, while species detection varied as a function of ambient humidity. Finally, for rhombifer, the probability of a site being occupied varied as a function of the number of riffles present within that transect, while species detection varied as a function of ambient temperature and wind velocity. And so in this image, you see the top model for Harderi, which was one incorporating the effects of search effort on species detection. And so you can see that shortly after about 5 hours of search effort, we have about a 50% chance of finding Harderi. Shortly after about 10 hours of search effort, our chances of spotting Harderi are about 75%. And then as you approach 15 hours of search effort, your chances of spotting Harderi begin to asymptote. And so you may be wondering, why was this the top model for Harderi and not something incorporating the site level covariate of the number of riffles present within that transect when I spent all that time telling you guys how much Harderi prefers riffle habitat? Well, I believe this to be a result of the process that we use to choose transect locations. So as I mentioned, site places were determined by a priori knowledge. So every transect location historically had Harderi present, and every transect had the appropriate microhabitat for Harderi. So they had in-stream riffle habitat and they had rocky shoreline. These transects just varied in terms of how much of that habitat they had available. So I think that's why we're not really seeing riffles come up as a competitive variable at the site level. In a separate analysis, I zoomed in on that habitat and I focused at the microhabitat level. And the results of that analysis showed that Harderi was between 8 and 35 times more likely to be found inside riffle habitat as opposed to outside riffle habitat. So they are still preferring in-stream riffle habitat. For those sites that were occupied by Harderi, the probability of detecting that species varied between 13% and 75%. For the two sympatric congeners, Erythrogaster and rhombifer, the probability of detecting those species varied as a function of environmental variables such as humidity, ambient temperature, and wind velocity. And this is not that surprising given what we know about these organisms. Prior studies have shown that wind velocity can really impact activity patterns of herpetofauna, snakes in particular. As ectotherms, it's not that surprising that ambient temperature could also be affecting their activities. And finally, as water snakes, these organisms may not be able to control water loss through their skin as well as some more terrestrial species. And so it's not surprising that humidity levels could also impact their activity patterns. Finally, for both of these species, the probability of a site being occupied by those organisms varied as a function of the amount of in-stream riffle habitat. And so combining this result as well as the separate analysis I mentioned for Harderi, where they were really preferring riffle habitat, we did see that in-stream riffle habitat was important for all three Nerodia species. As I mentioned earlier, all three of these water snakes are piscivorous as juveniles, and so they might be foraging for fish in those riffles. However, as adults, we begin to see some shifts in the foraging activities of these snakes. For example, as an adult, Harderi will still forage for minnows in particular. They will take larger minnows, and they tend to forage in deeper riffles than they do when they are juveniles. As I mentioned earlier, Erythrogaster will take some larger fish, but they're really known for their shift to an aneurophagous diet, so a diet of frogs, and particularly ranid frogs. In this system, ranid frogs can be found along bank microhabitat, but you can also pretty reliably find them in stream riffle habitat sheltered under rocks. And so Rithergaster may still forage in riffles as an adult. Finally, Rhombifer, as I mentioned, is piscivorous as an adult, but they really take larger fish, particularly larger sunfish and catfish, which are really known to inhabit deeper water. And Rhombifer is really known for this foraging method as an adult that is very successful in catching fish in much deeper water. And so they're probably not using in-stream riffle habitats for foraging as an adult. In that separate analysis I mentioned, I also looked at the effects of salt cedar on water snake occupancy. And so in that analysis, I found that both Erythrogaster and Harderi were negatively associated with increased salt cedar. However, Erythrogaster was only slightly less likely to be found in areas with increased salt cedar, while Harderi was much more negatively associated with increased salt cedar. So the species was actually 97% less likely to be found in areas of the Brazos River with increased salt cedar density along the bank. Interestingly, Rhombifer was positively associated with salt cedar. There have been many studies done in the American Southwest regarding herpetofauna and salt cedar, and those studies have found that generalist species are not only tolerant of salt cedar establishment, but are often the most successful species after salt cedar is established. And so for this reason, it's not that surprising that Rhombifer as a microhabitat and dietary generalist would be positively associated with increased salt cedar density. Along the same lines, it's not that surprising that Harderi, as a microhabitat specialist, would be so negatively associated with salt cedar, potentially intolerant to salt cedar. The question becomes, how intolerant is Harderi really to salt cedar? If we look at the site level and we incorporate salt cedar into our occupancy modeling, we see that Harderi still has a negative association with salt cedar. However, it's not until about 25% average salt cedar density along the bank that we see our chances of finding Harderi in that habitat drop to about 0. If we zoom in on that habitat and we focus at the microhabitat level where selection might actually be occurring, we see that at densities of higher than about 1% salt cedar, the probability of Harderi occupying that habitat drops to 0, really suggesting that they are in fact intolerant to salt cedar. I mentioned those studies done in the American Southwest regarding salt cedar, and there have been so many studies focused on that area because of the sheer amount of salt cedar in riparian habitats there. Oftentimes, salt cedar is a monoculture along the banks of these riparian habitats. Luckily, the section of the Brazos that I surveyed has not yet reached that monoculture status. However, as I mentioned, salt cedar is not only tolerant of disturbance events, but will often thrive and disperse and establish during disturbance events. And so increasingly severe stochastic weather events in the watershed could lead salt cedar to establish further down the river. There have been many studies looking at herpetofauna diversity and salt cedar removal, and those studies have found that after salt cedar is removed, herpetofauna diversity oftentimes increases. And so in this system, it would appear as if Erythrogaster and Rhombifer would probably not be too bothered by salt cedar removal, and Harderi would likely benefit from salt cedar removal. So we continue to see declines in Harderi. There are sites that were once occupied by Harderi, and they now appear to be unoccupied by Harderi. Salt cedar may be playing a role in those declines. Prior authors have suggested that competition with sympatric congeners could be a reason for declines in Harderi, but I don't believe this to be occurring because it seems as if these three Neurodia species are utilizing different portions of their habitat, both at the site level and the microhabitat level, potentially related to their foraging activities. And so in order for Harderi to persist into the future, I think that we need continued and more frequent monitoring of the species, both to gain a more accurate estimate of species survivorship and to continue to identify reasons behind their decline. I also believe that we need habitat management, both in the form of riffle preservation and salt cedar removal, to give these guys the best chance to persist into the future. There have been many people who have helped this project both get off the ground and see it to completion, and so I'm very thankful for everybody who gave me river access and helped me in the field, as well as analyze data. And I'm very thankful for Texas Parks and Wildlife for funding this project. And so With that, I will take questions. If you don't think of your question until later, feel free to email me at the address listed here.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks.
And just to note to everybody, you can put your questions in the Q&A window and you pop on it, or you can put them in the chat. Either way, we've got some questions in the chat that are kind of more broad, Jesse, about some of this
Mhm.
stuff. So I'll ask them, and maybe between the two of us, we can take care of them.
Okay.
So the first question is, are oops, are surveys or studies done before dams are constructed to learn about potential impacts on wildlife?
That would be a great thing to do. The problem is that, especially in some of these reservoirs in the United States, they were constructed quite a long time ago. For example, Possum Kingdom Reservoir was built in the 40s, and so I don't think there was uh, as many people paying attention to these sorts of things back then as we are now. And so having data before those types of structures were completed is pretty rare. But it definitely would be great to have to compare these organisms before and after.
And I'm aware of several new dam projects that have been proposed
Right.
over the years recently, where they have implemented surveys within the drainages that will be flooded to look at impacts
Mhm.
to rare and endangered species. And I think your point about probably them being a lot of those dams being built before the Endangered Species Act was passed, because
Mhm.
maybe the primary mechanism that would generate the need to do surveys would be some of that federal legislature. Okay, another question. How difficult is salt cedar to remove?
Ah.
Do you know, Jesse?
I have not tried to remove it, but there have been a lot of stuff done further west into Texas and further west into the United States to try to remove salt cedar. It's pretty difficult. You can't burn it because it thrives in those burn events and has that really interesting root system that can survive fire events. And so herbicides have been used. I don't know how successful they are, but it's kind of tough to target salt cedar alone and not affect other native riparian vegetation. I also know they've tried mechanical methods to just try and get the salt cedar up and out, but it's hard to remove it.
And on that note, forgive me if you said this, how extensive is it in the Brazos? Did you find it at all of the sites, a handful of the sites? Like, do you
So
recall?
it's pretty extensive in the upper reaches, like the headwaters of the Brazos. And there's been a lot of work done there. I know they've tried some different methods up there. In the section of the river that I surveyed, I had quite a few transects where there was no salt cedar. And then I had transects where you would find a plant here, a plant there, but you get further into the transect, and all of a sudden it's the dominant vegetation for a good stretch. So it's there. It's not a monoculture, like I said, but it is definitely there, and there's quite a few young plants in some areas. So it seems as if they're continuing to disperse.
Very good. Okay, we've got some more questions coming in now. Somebody asks, what is a stochastic weather event? I think probably the stochastic term is the issue there.
Yeah, yeah. So, stochastic weather events are things like the winter storm we had, where um, that sort of came out of the middle of nowhere and was really severe. You can think about tornadoes, hurricanes, severe flooding. So, stochastic weather events are normal in the environment. However, we're seeing them more frequently, and we're also seeing weather events that are more severe in nature. For example, really more intense tornadoes, more frequent tornadoes, more intense hurricanes, and more frequent. So, they are normal weather events that we see. However, they're happening more frequently and they're more severe.
Excellent. We have a question here about the reproductive biology of the species. What are the reproduction numbers of offspring per, I guess, per female and things like that?
Yeah, so the range of a litter in Harderite is between 7 and 23 offspring. They don't reach sexual maturity until at least their second year, and they generally have one litter per year.
Is litter size correlated with female body size? No?
I would think so. I don't know if anybody has specifically looked at that in the concha water snake or the Brazos water snake, but they are viviparous, so they give birth to live young. They don't lay eggs, and so I would assume so.
Okay, another question here. What is your opinion about taking an adaptive management approach and doing an experiment that manipulates salt cedar reduction and restoring riffles? Another aspect that could be incorporated is river flow slash geometry, as the riffle and run geometry is predictable mathematically. That's a great question.
That is a great question. I think that would be really interesting to do. I've gotten questions before about turbidity in a riffle, and I think that's a huge aspect because these snakes appear to be visually hunting for these minnows and these riffles. And so, increased sedimentation from salt cedar could really impact that as well. And so, I think that would be interesting. I think the problem is finding these different areas where you can influence the salt cedar density, and then finding areas where you can find harder eye reliably. That's another thing because, as I mentioned, there are these areas where they were so common, like the type locality, and now they're not there anymore. So I think that's a great idea. I don't know how easily that can be done, but if they come up with a way, I'm all about trying that.
And on that note, somebody also asked if salt cedar removal is possible, what would replace its function as bank stabilization?
Bank stabilization. That is a good question. I don't know too much about the native riparian vegetation that we do have, and which of those plants would be a good bank stabilizer. But considering the fact that these plant organisms have evolved in this area, I would think that we have a native equivalent that could do that. Um, I just don't, I can't think of a species off the top of my head that could sort of fill in that niche.
I know our inland fisheries group is involved with some active management of salt cedar in a different part of the river, right? I wonder what their approach is to sort of replacing salt cedar, if that's necessary, or if maybe it's not necessary.
Mhm.
Okay, relating to the previous question on reservoirs, what are your thoughts on potential impacts of the proposed Cedar Ridge Reservoir on the Clear Fork of the Brazos? You familiar with that, Jesse?
I am familiar with that. So this is a proposed impoundment of the Brazos River along Clear Fork, as you mentioned, kind of spanning Shackelford County and I think Throckmorton County as well. If this impoundment was to happen, it would flood about 55 kilometers of what has historically been really good harder eye habitat. And that seems pretty bad. We would lose that in-stream riffle habitat for these snakes. However, as I mentioned, we know that there are populations of harder eye in Possum Kingdom Reservoir and in Lake Granbury. We don't know um, if these populations are, as I mentioned, that if they have reduced fitness, I mean, they could have lower heterozygosity. Um, I don't know how that would further impact the species. I can only guess that it would continue to sort of split up the whole range of harder eye into these very disjunct populations that probably are not experiencing gene flow and they're not dispersing. So I think it would be bad for harder eye. I think that it would just be another sort of another link in their biology that's gone and is just another hit in terms of threats to harder eye.
Another question here. What are some of the cascading effects slash impacts of the decline of the species?
So one thing to think about is these impoundments and these alteration of river habitats. They, especially for this snake species, which is really known to be um, very particular in terms of habitat and is really known for its site fidelity. For instance, I caught a harder eye 1 year after I first found it in the exact same riffle. So they're really known to stay in this habitat that they really prefer. And so these these events where you're breaking up the river into these disjunct populations, if they're not dispersing and they're not experiencing gene flow, they're going to have reduced fitness. Their heterozygosity is going to go down. And we know that reductions in heterozygosity can impact species and make them more vulnerable to other events that could lead to local extirpations. For example, lower heterozygosity could impact their ability to deal with diseases such as snake fungal disease. And harder eye does have lower heterozygosity than erythrogaster or rhombifer. And so it's sort of just like a continuing circle of these events that put them in a worse position that leads to another event that they're not as able to deal with as well. And so it just becomes, it's what we call an extinction vortex.
And I wonder as well if the question was getting at some of the sort of ecological impacts. Um, if there's any, would there be any kind of impacts on prey populations or anything like that? But it sounds like there's probably enough redundancy in the system with the other snakes, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that they're definitely occupying the same foraging habitat and eating the same things as juveniles, but certainly probably not as adults.
Okay. Were the snakes you held to collect data relatively tame? Would they put up a struggle? Did some struggle more than others? Ooh, interesting.
So if you have held a water snake, ever, they tend to get a bad rap for their behavior. I adore water snakes. I think they're great. But yeah, they are a little smelly and they tend to give you a few little love bites. But that's just the nature of working with water snakes. Harder eye is what other colleagues have called it the wimpiest water snake or the saddest excuse of a water snake. Um, it's true. They tend not to bite as much, and their musk is relatively it's not as bad. And so dealing with harder eye was pretty easy. They were relatively tame. Rhombifer and erythrogaster, not quite as much, but that's just the name of the game.
Brilliant. What were your observations regarding recreational use of the river, fire ants, and the use of minnow traps as potential sources of mortality?
So, recreational use, yeah, that's a big one, especially downstream of Possum Kingdom Reservoir. So, a lot of my transects above PK were in areas oftentimes that were associated with private land. So, if those private landowners were not using that river as frequently as others, then there wasn't too much in terms of disturbance. But for instance, the type locality of harder eye is located downstream from Possum Kingdom and is also just directly downstream from this area where you have a lot of people accessing the river for recreation, for canoeing, for kayaking, and so especially for fishing as well. And so there's a lot of people using the river, and that's great. It's a beautiful section of river. There's a lot to do, and I think that's wonderful. Except the fact that these organisms could be scared off potentially, or their prey items are going to be picked off. We have sort of mechanical disturbance of those riffles as well. In terms of fire ants could definitely impact neonate harder eye. There have been some studies documenting the death of juvenile reptiles, including alligators and horned lizards. And so fire ants could definitely be an issue for neonate harder eye if they are sort of sheltered under a rock where these fire ants can find them and swarm them when they're outside of the water. And so that is definitely an issue. In terms of minnow traps, I personally never saw recreational minnow traps for, say, catching bait fish. But I did see plenty of people, say, looking for hellgrammites under rocks for baits. And so, if they flip a rock and find harder eye and they are not familiar with the snake and could potentially think it is a venomous snake, that could potentially not be so great for the snakes. So I think recreation could potentially impact them and definitely might. I did not personally observe direct mortality or direct persecution of harder eye as a result of recreation.